Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back, and we're going to speak now with Mark Bray about the AntiFa movement. He joins us from Dartmouth College, and he wrote a book called AntiFa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
A pleasure.
So why'd you write a book on the movement, and what is your relationship to it?
Sure. So I'm a longtime activist and historian. I was involved in Occupy Wall Street in New York City back in 2011, and I've been involved in a variety of social justice movements. And I started to realize that really with the resurgence of the alt-right, in the Trump era, when there's this concern about fascism, concern about white supremacist politics, that there's actually relatively little written about post-war anti-fascism, that being after World War II. Most people think of course, the World War II, they think of the socialists that fought against Hitler and Mussolini in the 20s and 30s, but know a lot less about the kind of second half of the story when self-defense groups were formed in Britain and Germany among immigrants and leftists and punks to defend themselves against a neo-Nazi skinhead wave that was kind of unleashed in response to waves of migration in that era, and how it moved over to the United States with the development of anti-racist action, and then continued through to today in the movement we're seeing right now.
And some people, including the president, Donald Trump, have associated Antifa with violent acts. Do you think that association is warranted?
Well, what people miss is that the vast majority of what anti-fascists do is nonviolent. They monitor the far right, they track them across various social media platforms, figure out who they're organizing with, find out where their events are going to be held, make phone calls to the owners of hotels or VFWs to get them to cancel the event. They spread popular education. So there's a variety of tactics that are used that do not involve any sort of confrontation, but of course the media focuses on the spectacle. But the other part of it is, though, that the anti-fascism is an argument for self-defense collectively against the proven historical perils of white supremacy and fascism, so that they don't shy away from asserting their right and the legitimacy of defending themselves.
And how is the group funded? And how do members of the organization interact or communicate with one another? Is it entirely via social media?
It isn't one specific group. It's more of an activity or a politics of social revolutionism applied to fighting the far right among communists, anarchists, and socialists, and a variety of radical leftists. They sometimes coordinate. For example, there's a Torch network where a number of North American anti-fascist groups coordinate and share resources and information, but generally they're autonomous, and they don't usually have a lot of money, so the kind of George Soros conspiracy theory is entirely inapplicable in this case, but I'm sure that they develop their own sources of funds for materials and so forth.
Yeah. And the first time I'd heard of this group was in relation to the Charlottesville protests. But you mentioned it's been around a lot longer than that in the U.S. Help us understand that.
Sure. So anti-fascism as a movement has existed globally for a century. But in the U.S., of course, we can look in the 20s and 30s to conflicts within Italian-American communities, within German-American communities, Jewish self-defense organizations formed in response to Nazi presence in the United States. But in its modern incarnation, we can look at really the late 1980s into the 90s with the formation of anti-racist action, who essentially developed in response to neo-Nazi skinhead attacks on punk venues and alternative scenes, but grew into a broader network with hundreds of chapters around the country that defended reproductive rights, that did a wide variety of organizing against the far right, and of course, more broadly speaking, opposition to the KKK and the black liberation struggle's need for organizing against the far right was very prominent in the 50s, 60s, and onward, and dates back for centuries.
At a campaign rally in Phoenix this past week, I'm sure as you well know, President Trump called out Antifa for protesting his rallies. The president made this remark after someone in the crowd interrupted his speech.
How did he get in here? He's supposed to be with a few people outside. How about all week they're talking about the massive crowds that are going to be outside? Where are they? Well, it's hot out. It is hot. I think it's too warm. They show up in the helmets and the black masks, and they've got clubs, and they've got everything. Antifa!
How do you respond to that?
I mean, at this point, Donald Trump has lost any sense of credibility on making much of a comment on anything, in my opinion. Certainly, he's trying to discredit a certain faction of the anti-racist movement, which has asserted the legitimacy of collective self-defense. I mean, the thing to remember is that when it comes to facing some of the most deadly people in society, we need to be ready to do that, and that's what anti-fascists argue, and that's what they're prepared to do. I mean, the fact of the matter is sometimes good guys don't wear white, as the old song used to say.
Yeah. I have to ask you, your Dartmouth University put out a statement in relation to your book, and they write this: we condemn anything but civil discourse in the exchange of opinions and ideas. Dartmouth embraces free speech and open inquiry in all matters, and all on our campus enjoy the freedom to speak, write, listen, and debate in pursuit of better learning and understanding. However, the endorsement of violence in any form is contrary to Dartmouth values. First of all, are you endorsing violence in your writing about this group, and what do you make of that statement?
I've been very clear consistently that I'm in favor of collective self-defense against neo-Nazis and white supremacists. As a historian, as an activist, as a Jewish descendant of victims of the Holocaust, I think it's very clear the historical record and the historical need to do so. That statement was made in response to a misrepresentation and oversimplification of my comments by far-right pseudo-media. And I would also like to add that, to my knowledge, there's a petition signed by over 100 Dartmouth faculty in support of my position and my academic freedom. So certainly I am in favor of free speech. I'm against those who are the greatest enemies to free speech, which are fascists.
Let's go to the phones. We have Mary calling from Annville, Pennsylvania. She's a Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. I really admire Mr. Bray. I think that, in my opinion, the American soldiers in World War II were the first American anti-fascists. It's important to push back by putting their physical bodies between violent fascists and their victims. And if Antifa is accused of being violent, it's only because they're provoked. Thank you.
Care to weigh in there, Mark?
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree that we've seen historically the threat that fascism and Nazism can pose. We've seen that sometimes, as the caller said, putting our bodies in between fascists and vulnerable members of our society is important. We've seen with the tragic death of Heather Heyer what they'll resort to. And I think that, really what we're talking about is not that complicated. We're talking about the threat of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. We've seen what they can do, and we need to be prepared for that.
We're talking with Mark Bray. We're taking your calls as well. The line for Republicans is 202-748-8001. Democrats call 202-748-8000. Independents call 202-748-8002. We're taking your tweets as well. Here's one. Steve writes, Mr. Bray is exactly what Antifa should be, unflappable, not given to provocation. Let's go to Mel, who's calling from Frewsburg, New York, on the line for Independents. Good morning.
As I listen to the discussion, I can't help but think of the English social critic Malcolm Muggeridge, who said that fascism and communism are the same show. Therefore, fascism is on the left. It's really not a right-wing movement because fascism controls people. And notice how the anti-fascists also want to control. They will introduce themselves even in a violent way, as was on display in Berkeley, California. And you see this movement trying to impugn the right when the neo-Nazis are actually left-wing. National Socialist Party, that's left-wing. So this use of words is something that the public needs to be very careful on in discerning how language is being used, because the anti-fascists are left-wing and the fascism is left-wing as well. The anti-fascists are those on the right who support the Constitution, who want the free market, who believe in equal justice for all, not equal outcomes for all.
Thank you for that. Well, I can tell you as a historian of fascism that there is no credible historian who believes that fascism is a left-wing ideology. The main debate is whether fascism is a right-wing ideology or neither left nor right. We can see historically that although early fascists made claims to being the true socialists and argued that for a national socialism or national syndicalism that could essentially use socialist principles in the interest of the nation, socialists are consistently anti-national, are consistently in favor of class struggle rather than national unification. And when when fascists have gained power, they have jettisoned and completely discarded any trappings of socialism or egalitarianism. They are fundamentally different, and it's really an attempt by the right wing to really mar the historical record, to confuse people. You can make the argument that certainly right-wing libertarianism is different from fascism, but fascism is by no means a left-wing mode of thought.
And here's Cynthia calling from New York, New York. Cynthia is a Democrat.
Hi. Yeah, I became a Democrat to support Bernie Sanders, and I hung around after because you have to be a Democrat to vote in the primaries, which are the only game in town in New York. But aside from that, since we're talking about Antifa, when I was in New York in the 80s, we had big skinhead movement, and I went to burn a flag in Washington Square Park on July the 4th, the year that they were having the controversy in Texas over the communists burning the flag, just as a free speech support kind of demonstration. And the Nazis showed up in force. They marched in formation around the park. They maced me. They beat me to the ground while the media took pictures, and the cops pointed and laughed. And then there was a big story in the Village Voice next week saying that there had been a deal between the police and the skinheads ahead of time. That got me involved in anti-fascism. So I kept doing it for some years until I got pregnant with my first child. Then they threatened to cut the baby out of my stomach if he turned out to have a black father. So I went into hiding and I stopped. But fortunately, others have taken up the cause, and I want to thank you. And that's really all I had to say.
Let's go now to Keith calling from Oldsmar, Florida. Keith is an independent. Good morning.
Yes, I have a comment or two, one for C-SPAN and one for your guest. Yes, I would agree with you, Mr. Bray, that the neo-Nazis are racist and all that. But the left wing, in their historical perspective, such as Russia, killed as many Jews as Germany did during World War II. It just took them a longer period of time. Stalin was very anti-Jewish, very racist in his country. So leftists have no moral ground, high ground, on whatever you say. So another thing is, during the campaign for the presidency of this election cycle, that would be Trump versus Hillary, the Democrats put people in Trump's crowd to cause a disturbance that's directly out of the fascist handbook from the 20s and 30s when Hitler took power. So the leftists and the rightists have no moral high ground, and that would include you in your book.
So a couple things to address. First, I am very clearly, in all my writings, anti-Stalinist. I make no efforts to defend Stalin. Number two, the question of whether or not no platforming a fascist group is therefore a fascist action. Certainly it is an illiberal action. It differs from the sort of classical liberal notion of solving social problems through the alleged free market of ideas. But to say that all illiberal politics are essentially the same through the kind of mode of extremism that is very popular is to essentially normalize the center and equate ISIS with anarchists, which is really ahistorical and lacking in any sort of content. The notion that what defines fascism is disrupting speeches is really missing the point of fascism as an authoritarian, violent, hierarchical doctrine that has killed millions of people. And so I think that disrupting a fascist event does not in any way mean that you're a fascist. It simply means that you're not going to go by the liberal playbook for defeating fascism, which we've seen fail in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
And we should establish a definition. What is fascism in the way that you describe it?
Sure. Well, fascism is notoriously difficult to define because fascists have adopted and discarded ideas more readily than probably any other ideology, but it really grows out of the prioritization of the nation or the race over everything else in a perceived social Darwinian struggle for survival. It entails a glorification of violence, masculinity, and cult of personality, and really focuses on class collaboration and unifying the working class and the upper class in the interest of the nation, and in that way differs fundamentally from left politics, which tend to promote class struggle and the interests of the working class. But I will point out that anti-fascists organize against the far right more broadly, not just against textbook fascists.
All right, let's go to Lewis, who's calling from Pennsauken, New Jersey, on the line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Your organization mirrors the Nazis when Hitler was gaining power, the brown shirts. You guys show up at political rallies, you intimidate people, you beat people up, you disrupt meetings. Where to get off? I was an anti-Trump guy. I showed up at some of those, and I seen your guys spit on children, pepper spray women, attack people from behind and run away, and you guys are wearing the brown shirts or a mask. I mean, where do you get off? You guys are the fascists. You're against free speech. If they don't agree with you, you beat them up. Thank you, sir.
Okay, well, so first of all, I am not a member of any AntiFa group, and AntiFa is not a single group. Second, also to point out once again that disrupting a far-right event does not therefore mean you're far-right. Historically, we can see how anti-fascists have used a variety of tactics to disrupt fascist meetings in the 20s and 30s. They would infiltrate events and sing and have singing protests over the speaker. There's a variety of tactics to do this, and really fascism entails in illiberal politics, just like socialism or anarchism, but that does not mean they're the same. There are very clear political differences, and to reduce politics to tactics is really ahistorical and apolitical. Rather than looking at an action, let's look at why it's carried out and who it's carried out against.
Let's hear from Bob, who's calling from Tahlequah, Ohio, or Oklahoma, forgive me. He's a Democrat. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning to you. It's a good subject that you're covering. The name of the town is Tahlequah.
All right, thank you for that correction.
Yeah, and it's the Cherokee capital. The Cherokee tribe is the largest Native American tribe left in the country. Just wanted to mention that. We're located between Tulsa and Fayetteville in the beautiful hills of northeastern Oklahoma. And I want to say today I appreciate you, Mr. Anti-Fascist. Yeah, and let's define anti-fascism in the modern sense. In the current sense of the word, you would have to be opposed to prohibition on cannabis if you're anti-fascist, and opposed to the Jim Crow culture that come along with keeping the American farmer down and keeping the blacks and the hippies from having their weed. And now, in the modern sense, to keep everyone from having their homegrown medicine. So let's speak to that issue if you're truly anti-fascist.
Yeah, I can assure you that anti-fascists are against the criminalization of marijuana. Yeah, I can assure you that pretty confidently. Yeah.
Let's talk with Tom, calling from Euless, Texas, on the line for Republicans. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, I just want to say Antifa is nothing but a violent, America-hating communist terrorist cell infested with nothing but violent cockroaches and vermin, and every single cockroach and vermin in Antifa, they've got to be exterminated.
Okay, let's...
I'm not going to comment on that one.
Yeah, let's go to
on.
Jesse, who's calling from New Albany, Indiana, on the line for Independence. Good morning, Jesse.
Yeah, I just wanted to call. This gentleman, I'm going to tell you, if I sent my child to Dartmouth to receive an education, and this gentleman were to be the one to educate them, I would be really upset that I wasted all that tuition. He has no idea what fascism is, has no clue. He sat there just a while ago and said, well, instead of looking at the act of violence, you need to look at who the act's perpetrated against and why. Well, look, fascism is really simple. It's not a difficult concept. You have a group in power, and they use violence to push their agenda. And that's exactly what Antifa does. That's not hard. And if you read Orwell's 1984, and Orwell was a socialist, but he recognized the inherent problems in a proletarian society. And you ought to have your guests explain how a proletarian society would work with fascism and how it works with socialism and communism, and see if he can explain the difference there. I think he'd have a difficult time. He's ridiculous. I'm sure his book's ridiculous, and I'd be really upset if I spent money to send my child to Dartmouth to listen to him.
Okay, well, first of all, what you're describing as fascism, where a group rules society and imposes their rule with force, is essentially what the state does. The state, regardless of which state, with police forces, with prisons, with military. So if you're against that type of rule, you may well be an anarchist. You should consider that. The second part is in terms of the difference between fascist control and sort of a Soviet socialist control. Once again, I am not a Stalinist, neither was George Orwell, and his critique was against an authoritarian society, which is what I'm against and many anti-fascists are against. And so fascism cannot simply be reduced to state control. It has a very specific historical context, having much to do with the immediate aftermath of World War I, with the response of society to a perceived quote-unquote decadence in response to the growth of bourgeois capitalism. It's very historically situated, and you can't reduce it simply to the control of a specific group over a state, which is what states are.
And lastly, let's hear from Cynthia calling from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on the line for Democrats. Good morning, Cynthia.
Good morning. Thank you for having this discussion. I think it's very relevant to what's going on in the United States right now. I'm totally a supporter of resistance to the alt-right. I think that their designs on America are a threat to our liberty. However, I must say I saw an interview this week in a park between an Antifa women leader and a white supremacist male. And the male was polite and the female was rude and said violence was justified. Now, I understand this does not represent the movement, but it does harm to the movement of resistance to fascism in America when you have someone advocating violence like this woman was. And I just wanted to mention that we have to repeatedly say this is a nonviolent, I like your term, self-defense for the country or self-defense for the movement. It should be self-defense. And as in any self-defense situation, you cannot throw the first rock. You cannot initiate violence. You can only protect yourself. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I mean, the anti-fascist argument, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, is understanding self-defense in an immediate sense and also in a preemptive sense, looking back in history and seeing by the time World War II started, it was already too late for many people, and realizing that the most effective way to stop the advance of fascism is when it's small, when we can see, for example, that Mussolini's initial fascist nucleus had only 100 members at first, and being able to stop its advance at that point. And doing so, as we can see, is dangerous, and people need to be prepared for that and also really attuned to the potential dangers of what this represents.
Mark Bray is a historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe. He's currently a lecturer at Dartmouth College, and his book is AntiFa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.